Good day, everyone. We are delighted to have you here with us today. I am Tams Nicholson, the Executive Director of allcreatures.org. We were founded in 1998 and are the pioneer website in the U.S. for faith-based animal rights veganism. We exist for all people seeking current or past facts, knowledge, and information, and offer decades of free vegan and animal rights resources. We enjoy creating community to unite compassionate and empathetic humans who honor the dignity of each and every living being that God creates so that all life thrives on a flourishing planet Earth. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have Matthew King here with us. Matthew is the president of the Christian Animal Rights Association, which he co-founded with his wife Nina. He is the author of I Will Abolish the Bow, Christianity, Personhood, and the End of Animal Exploitation, and Meet the New Cigarette, Patient Advocacy, and the Plant-Based Diet. And his newest release, Pride Goes Before Destruction, Human Vanity, Animal Agriculture, and the New Covenant Solution. Matthew is also a registered nurse. Matthew, we are so delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tams. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I want to take a minute and just say that I've had the pleasure of reading Matthew's book, and I believe this is an absolute must for Christians who believe that sin has consequences. Matthew offers a compelling argument concerning our obligations and call to action, and provides an abundance of really thought-provoking resources. The book takes on arguments from scripture that our animal eating brothers and sisters always tend to use to invalidate faith-based vegans. I just hope everyone would consider reading it. It is a true and needed piece of literature for our world today. And I'm excited to talk about the book. But before we jump in the book, let's start at the beginning, the very, very beginning. Let's talk about your story, Matthew.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you so much for your endorsement again too. I really appreciate that.
Certainly.
And and thank you for everybody for attending too. But my story actually, so as far as it actually starts in 2013. It started when my wife actually brought home a Sheltie. His name is Ripley, still around today. And before I met Ripley, actually, I never really understood animals because my parents are Victorian furniture collectors, and so that was always a big. The idea of having pets in the house was always a big no-no. But when I started taking care of Ripley, I really had no idea what to do with dogs. But I would feed him, and then after he was done eating, I would always notice there was peas at the bottom of the bowl. And I thought it was really strange too, because I always thought like animals were like machines. And so I started watching him a little bit closer, and I noticed that he had been spitting out the peas actually as I fed him later. And so I realized then that animals have preferences, feelings, emotions, and it was something that I never realized until then. And just like I don't like Brussels sprouts, I found out that Ripley doesn't like peas, and so that really changed my vision of animals. And then the veganism didn't come until a little bit later, actually, because it all started actually when my wife Nina, we're both nurses, and so she was driving back from the hospital the one night, and she had worked a 16-hour shift, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. She was really tired, slapping herself awake, trying to stay awake on the drive home. And she was going down a very busy road that usually has deer on it, and she saw a sign that says deer crossing. And so then after that, she went home and she went to bed very tired, woke up the next morning and was like, "Hey, Matt, I don't think I can eat meat ever again." And I was like, "That's really bizarre. Like, why? What led to that?" And then she was like, "I had a dream last night that I had a dream that I was looking at this deer and I was slaughtering him. And he said, if you're going to slaughter me, you might as well eat your dog. Or if you're going to eat me, you might as well eat your dog too." And so then at that moment, she went vegetarian actually. And then I thought it was a little bit crazy, but I also had a similar story actually in 2014 that sort of went along with that. Was I was watching a movie called Southern Comfort, it's like sort of like a Deliverance knockoff, but it's about like these four guys that are training in military down in Louisiana, and they're messing with these locals, and then the locals get back at them. They kidnap them and then bring them to their village. And there actually was this like sort of isolated village, and they were like the village was going to slaughter pigs that day, and the locals, they're going to slaughter pigs. And then the crew of the film said, well, we might as well catch it on camera because it's going to be scarier. And so then they actually killed these pigs. I thought it was maybe just makeup or practical effects, but it was actually real. I looked up, and they showed them skinning them and killing them and everything else. And after that, I was like, I can no longer eat meat from mammals. That just disturbs me to even think about that. And so that was for me. I was still eating chicken after that, but that same year, actually, I was eating chicken wings at a restaurant, and as I was eating them, I could feel the bones, and I was like, these bones feel so much like my dogs, and it was just so bizarre, and I couldn't eat chicken again after that either. So I was still on fish at that point. Um, so I was pescatarian, sort of floating between vegetarian and pescatarian. And then the funniest part of this actually is in 2016, my wife watched Earthlings, which is I'm sure a lot of people might be aware. It's a documentary all about factory farming. And so that was the moment she watched that, and she was like, I no longer want to eat eggs or milk because of the cruelty in those industries. And I was like, oh, this is crazy now. Like, I mean, vegetarian and pescatarian, that's fine, but like vegans are nuts. Like this is, those people are nuts. I don't want to be one of them. Like this is going too far. And then she sort of challenged me, and she said, well, how about this? If you won't support me being vegan or won't be vegan yourself, will you at least watch the movie? So then I stormed off into my office, and I was like, I really don't need to listen to this. I was very upset that, that she was challenging me on it. And so then like 20 minutes went by, and I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, if I think I know what's going to happen here is I'm going to watch Earthlings. I'm going to go vegan. And so let's just skip all that like painful stuff. Let's not watch the DVD, the documentary, and I'll just do what I need to do. And then Nina started making all this really interesting and tasty food, and so it was actually quite easy with the vegan journey. And I sort of went vegan to avoid watching Earthlings. So
that is a great story. And I love the way all of our experiences are so different. Some of us are influenced by our partners. And oh my gosh, it just warms my heart to hear that. So I'm curious, that's your partner, but what was the reaction of your friends and family? What was that like?
uh you know what I can't say that I really ever felt isolated. I know a lot of people, they talk about when they go vegan, they feel isolated. And I'm a millennial. I was born in 1990, and I've found that a lot of my generation is mostly supportive. A lot of times because they know sort of what goes on in factory farming, or they're at least aware that the contributions to climate change and the environmental destruction involved. And there's some awareness, and so millennials, in my experience, have always been supportive, and my friends were always supportive. And if they weren't extremely supportive, they never made jokes or anything like that. So I had a pretty good experience with my friends. My family was supportive. I know my twin sister was especially supportive. She's always she eats vegan herself most of the time, and she's always spotting stuff at the grocery store, showing it to me like, hey, this is vegan. And then she'll go to vegan festivals all the time with us. And then my mom, she's been really super supportive lately too. Like she's been willing to learn recipes. And so in my experience, veganism has been mostly pleasant. Yeah, I mean, the only negatives I ever got was people online that maybe were an acquaintance or trolls, I guess we would call them.
And I think I want to just ask straight into that. So you all have been vegan for a few years now. How has that changed your view of the world? What is it like for you now as an individual outside of all the work you're doing with your organization and the books?
Oh, that's probably the toughest question. Is well, it's almost cliche too because it's kind of like the movie The Matrix. Um, in the movie, there's this situation where the main character Neo, he's presented with this situation where he's either going to take the red pill or the blue pill. And the red pill, it means to learn a potentially unsettling or life changing truth by taking the red pill, or the blue pill is remaining in the contented experience of ordinary reality. And so, with that, um, I feel like I've taken the red pill. I see human nature for what it really is without any sort of misguided ideas. And growing up, I always sort of prided myself on reason. I have some family members that, no matter what you say to them, regardless of evidence, they'll persist in their beliefs despite contradicting data. And so I always valued being able to change my mind when presented with uncomfortable or opposing evidence. And my young, naive self believed that other humans pride themselves on reason too. And with veganism, I found that that's not the case at all. Most of humanity, when presented with videos of animal cruelty and farming, resort to defense mechanisms or avoidance rather than grappling with reality. It's made me less hopeful and somewhat jaded because I feel like I can't connect with humanity as easily as I once did. It's made me feel somewhat gaslit because humans throughout my life have taught me to look for the truth, do what's right. And then I live by those principles that society encourages, but then society either ignores you or mocks you for actually looking for the truth and doing what's right. And so it's made me realize how the vast majority of humanity is either hypocritical, calloused, emotionally immature. I say this because I was moved by pictures of animal cruelty, and when others are not, it makes me question why I'm compassionate and why they're not that way.
Yeah, that's great, and that's really I love that's in the introduction of your book as well. And I think we all go through that. I know I certainly did, where you realize that the truth is not the truth, and how do you reconcile everything, and how do you walk by yourself in so many circumstances, and still yet move forward in a positive way and take others with you. And I really love to see the outcome you've chosen to take others with you. But before that's your organization, but before we go there, I just want to ask, I think it's fun to talk about what's your most memorable experience in your vegan lifestyle so far.
Oh, you know what? Thinking of that, I think it was probably in 2016. It was the time I met a couple of cows. It was when I had first gone vegan. And the thing that disturbed me, I found out how cruel the dairy industry is. And even when I was like sort of vegetarian, pescatarian, I had funded dairy, and I had been raised drinking milk since my youth. Then you see all the commercials about got milk, all these different things that are advertised for you about milk, and then you think like, oh, it doesn't really harm the animals either. I mean, in meat, I think everybody's sort of aware that it hurts the animals. In dairy, that connection's not as easily shown. But I was just stunned by the amount of cruelty I had funded all those years without knowing it. And dairy inherently, like probably a lot of the viewers know, it's a lot of it's usually the male calves will get turned into veal, and then the mothers they'll go through pregnancy and have their children killed, and so just the inherent cruelty of that. But in 2016, I decided to do something about it, and so I looked online where I could find like where I could help cows, and so I found Intraloka Animal Sanctuary in Eastern PA. I met Ogie and Mookie. They were these two cows. They were young at the time, but we had so much fun meeting them in 2016. We drove out and met them, and Ogie actually has passed since, but Mookie, he's still alive, and he's my buddy, and we sponsor him. And after I started sponsoring him, I felt this sort of guilt relief because I was doing something to make up for the bad things that I had done before and that I had funded. And so I made sort of a reconciliation between my previous actions, and that was very memorable for me. First ever sort of vegan moment I had.
That's beautiful. Um, and with that in mind, I want to ask, what kind of advice or encouragement would you give new vegans today that are facing, this truth that's not truth, and then the realization of what they've been participating in, and maybe isolation? There's just so many factors that make it hard for people to start when they don't have resources. So what kind of encouragement or advice can you give?
Oh, sure. Well, the first thing I would say too is great job for doing the right thing. It takes an enormous amount of fortitude, strength, and bravery to oppose society, the conditioning that they place on us before we can make really informed decisions. And so I want to applaud you for that. But second, I think what helps too, make sure you surround yourself on social media with like-minded activists. I know there's a lot of Christian vegan groups on Facebook, probably around 10 to 15, and even more in the secular category. But if you can find local vegans at animal rights protests, that's a great way to connect too. I know in Pittsburgh, where I live, we have a local group that we stay in touch with, a lot of like-minded people that way. And then also attend vegan festivals too. That's a really great way to meet people and familiarize yourself with vegan businesses in your area. And then I think as far as staying vegan too, the most important thing is, and there's some truth to this, but I think it's somewhat easy to stay vegan when you think about the victims. That's why it's important to follow animal rights organizations on social media or keep in touch with them through email. Many organizations make aware the tremendous suffering involved with how industries treat animals. And in my experience, reminding yourself of that suffering, it makes it easier to avoid animal products when you're at family and social gatherings, and it makes it much easier to give into temptation.
Yes, yes, great advice. Thank you. So, with your passion, the two of you started an organization. I'd love to hear the history about that and how it morphed from just an idea or thought to taking a full blown nonprofit, and anything else you'd like to share about that journey.
Oh, sure thing. Yeah, and I'm really glad you asked me that question too, because I know a lot of the questions previously I've answered. And if other people were aware of my other interviews, you might have heard this before. But this might be a new story, actually. But I don't share it often. But I actually almost died in 2018 from I had a really bad Crohn's disease flare, and I was diagnosed in 2012, and it was controlled with medication. And flares are common. Most people will have at least one in their life, and the one I had was really bad, and I actually had to get 5 feet of intestines removed. But I'd lost 65 pounds. I was down to like 125 pounds. I was really emaciated. Like I said, I almost died. I think if it would have been 2 more weeks, I probably would have died if I didn't get surgery. But I recovered. To my surprise, actually, but actually after I recovered, I had this sort of explosive desire to do something sort of radical and meaningful, and sort of find meaning in the pain and suffering that I went through. Um, so I started thinking about things that I never thought of before, like the idea of like self actualization, legacy. I started to think about what was I leaving behind, and what have I done with my life? What have I done with my life so far? And I sort of decided on whatever I do in the future, I want to contribute positively to the world. And the people that I often admire the most in the world too are like Gene Bauer from Farm Sanctuary, Desmond Doss. He was the subject of that movie Hacksaw Ridge. He saved 75 soldiers. He was a conscientious objector, and so he refused to to carry a gun. But he saved 75 soldiers out in the field, and he he never he went to court actually to not hold a gun because he was so against them. But he saved people regardless. And then also, I really admired Harriet Tubman and William Wilberforce. They helped end the slave trade. And so these were people that saw injustice and opposed it through radical means. And I thought I could do the same for animals. And so we started Kara in 2019 with the vision of trying to help make the world look like Isaiah 11:6-9, where humans and animals live peacefully together without harm or exploitations. And so through education and legislation, we oppose the exploitation of animals regarding food, entertainment, fashion, and experimentation.
Wow. And we already have questions coming in too, but for those entering questions, we'll just keep them to the end. I have questions coming in on my text too. So I want to shift to, you shared now how it began and your passion. And I didn't know that about you with the Crohn's. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're okay and thriving, I might add.
Thank you. Not a story I tell a lot of people too, because it's just like I actually, it's funny because my wife will always laugh because like we were watching like a movie or something, and it had listed like it was from like 2009, but the future was 2018, and I was like, oh my god, like that year just it gives me fear just thinking about it. It was just such a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm so glad you're all right. So how have you seen growth in your organization over the years? And I know you've also written several books. So I'm curious. Maybe also I want to do a tie-in question asking you about like how has your professional background played into the books too?
Oh, sure. Well, the organization has definitely grown steadily. We've made a lot of connections with like-minded individuals and collaborated with several organizations with similar goals, and so that's been really great. And then you had a question too about it was how my professional life has fed into the organization. And I know one thing too. That one thing about nursing that's really helped me is it's nursing kind of teaches you to look at the root of problems, and that was sort of why I wrote this latest book actually. And Pride Goes Before Destruction. I sort of focused on what was the underlying problem, and um, where does the problem originate. And my background as a nurse, it sort of made me look and address the root of the problem. And with animals, I noticed that a lot of the conversation around how Christians treat animals is based on hubris. And so we elevate ourselves so far above animals, and that's how we justify locking them in cages, castrating and dehorning them, never letting them see sunshine. And Proverbs 16:18, it says, "Pride goes before destruction." And fitting to that verse, what humans do to animals ends up hurting human health and the environment. And so I discuss in this latest book how we should view animals through this lens of, or how we view animals through this lens of pride, and that we're hurting ourselves through that. And so that's one positive way that my profession is lent to my my running of this organization as well, is always looking at the root of the issue.
Thank you. And I'm curious, like, founders often change roles as an organization grows, and how are you seeing your own role and Nina's role change? And do you have any dreams or needs, or are you looking for volunteers, or anything you'd like to share about that?
Sure, yeah, and well, before 2022 too, we were almost exclusively just doing education, and so it was like, hey, what do I say with this verse, and reaching out to Christians and teaching them how to respond to a lot of verses that people use to justify animal exploitation. And then during and post 2022, there's been a lot of speaking with politicians and companies that exploit animals. We started getting involved in a lot of legislation in 2022, which I'm infinitely thankful for, because it really opened up a lot more opportunity. And not that there's great opportunity with education, but this side of legislation, it's really kept us busy, and it really feels very meaningful as well. Like in 2022, actually, we helped get a number of legislations passed, like the FDA Modernization Act, as well as the Big Cat Public Safety Act. There was a lot of letters and speaking with politicians to try to move that forward, and we ended up getting it at the end of 2022. So that was really great. And then also in early 2022, we started an animal blessing program, and the goal with that was to sort of we always see like dog and cat blessings, which is great, of course, but it was there's very rarely any programs dedicated to farm animals. And so we collaborated with Peaceful Field Sanctuary in Virginia in early 2022, and we blessed like 5 to 7 animals and talked about their story. And it was a really great way to do activism too, because it was sort of non-confrontational, and a lot of Christians really liked that. A lot of secular people enjoyed it. It was just a nice seeing the farm animals get blessed, which is a sort of a rare opportunity.
It certainly is rare, and I'm so glad to see that that's changing. I know there are some other programs for chaplains now as well. So I think in time, it will, as we shift into this vegan world, I can only imagine how wonderful it will be where there's no more speciesism in the church, and you can get a blessing as easily for a creature as you can a human being. And because of people like yourself and so many others, that day will one day become a reality, and I'm just very grateful. Yeah. And how can a person contact your organization, and do you want to tell them what your URL is so they'll know how to get there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And we have, you can contact us through our email, which is info@christiananimalrights.com. I can put that through the message here too. I'll just do that. And then also, yeah, christiananimalrights.com. I think we might have that. Yeah, we have that saved on there. But the email is info@christiananimalrights.com. Our website is christiananimalrights.com. And then there's an inquiry form on there too. If anybody has any questions, they can send. And then also you can contact us on Facebook or Instagram, as well as Twitter.
Awesome. And we've had a question that has come in that I feel it's more appropriate to ask now. So I'm going to share it on the screen before we jump to your books.
Sure.
So Brian is asking, I have friends that are Christian that tell me to be quiet when I try to speak up for God's animals. What tips do you have to help?
Well, and Christians too tend to be very anthropocentric, which is like the idea that humans always come first, and whatever way, even small, that benefits humans or seemingly benefits humans, it's to do it against the animals. And so I think what's a good conversation too, talking about veganism or trying to get people to decrease animal products, is focus on the human issues, at least at first. Like talk about the health of veganism. That's always very helpful. Or maybe even the destruction of the environment. That's always a good topic to bring up, and how destructive factory farming is. And then a lot of times I've noticed that when you show animal cruelty, at least to people, they'll shy away from it. But you might get lucky. I mean, if you do talk about animals, but you know what, too, in all the years of activism I've done too, I've found that there's not a cookie cutter or rhyme or reason way to activists, and so I just kind of say whatever anymore. It's like, animals are getting killed. That's what it is. If you can't handle it, then so there's not a lot of cookie cutter methods, I would say too, and sometimes it's just you got to try what works, and everybody has their own method.
They do. They do. Our founder, for example, he likes to make a statement that he uses often, and then he just really gives them time to think. So every way we try is multifaceted, and something we would do will surely reach that individual. And I know some people, I think, they have a trauma background, and they are just so scared to hear any kind of violence, that when I encounter those people, I lean more toward the positive things that it does for the creatures and earth versus using the violence. It's just so individual, and I love what you're suggesting, that there isn't any cookie cutter approach, because I think that's 100% true.
Right. What might, and a lot of times too, it's like, telling someone the truth too, it releases you from obligation. If they can't handle the truth, that's on them.
Yes. Yeah. So, I'm just absolutely dying to talk about your books. And the most recent release is Pride Goes Before Destruction. Let's start there. What was your inspiration for this book?
Oh, sure. And well, much of the text, it was actually discarded information from my previous book, I Will Abolish the Bow. And a lot of it was like information that I didn't really, I knew what I wanted to say, but I didn't really have a place to say it in I Will Abolish the Bow. And so I sort of always had this idea of a sequel in my mind, or a follow up. And so a lot of materials from that. And, but like I was saying earlier too, a lot of it is, I was looking at the root of the issue again about, what our treatment of animals, where does that originate from? And with animals, I noticed a lot of the conversation around how Christians treat animals is based on hubris, and we elevate ourselves so far above animals that's how we justify locking them in cages, castrating and dehorning them, and never letting them see sunshine. But the Bible says pride goes before destruction, and so when we hurt humans, it ends up hurting ourselves as well. And so with that, I discuss how we view animals through this lens of pride and how we're hurting ourselves, and then I focused on probably the most ignored verse in the Bible, Hosea 2:18, which implies that the new covenant in Christ includes animals. And so then I call Christians to embrace Hosea 2:18, which includes ethical consideration to animals, which is veganism, and that it can help heal ourselves, the environment, and our relationship with other species. So then I answer objections to this, like why didn't Jesus exactly show kindness to animals at times? And then I also make a case for regulations around meat existing, like the kosher laws and the Jerusalem Quadrilateral still being in effect, and that would help push believers towards following the Hosea 2:18 covenant, or closer to veganism. And then finally, I answer some questions related to meat, interpretation of the Bible, as well as the afterlife. And then another thing that inspired me too was Martin V. Cisneros. He had an article on allcreatures.org, your organization, and it's titled Hosea 2:18, God's New Covenant Between Man and Animal. And when I read that, I realized that Hosea 2:18 was part of Christ's New Covenant, and that had been an underdeveloped argument in Christian history. And so that was a big inspiration. And then as well, I read an article on Medium by James Bean. It's titled Evidence That Jesus and the Original Aramaic Christians Were Vegetarians. And I combined the understanding of Hosea 2:18 with the fact that there was solid historical evidence that Christ condemned meat, advocated for meat abstention, and probably taught his apostles to abstain. And so the early church condemned eating meat. I put these ideas together and built upon that foundation. And then also, that was actually probably most of the inspiration.
Oh my gosh, what wonderful inspiration. And I just have to ask, what is your favorite part of the book, or an example of what you believe others might really latch on to? Is there something that stands out to you? I mean, there certainly is me, but I want to ask you first.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple. I know the numerous sources outside of the Bible that depict Jesus being sympathetic to vegetarianism or even being a vegetarian himself. I was shocked by that information. And then there's also a very old Syriac translation of Luke 21 where Jesus criticizes the eating of meat. Um, and then there's also many early sources outside the Bible which report that many of the disciples and early church abstained from eating meat. And then I also talk a lot in the book about later additions to the Bible, like for instance the fish and the miracle of feeding the 5,000 with Jesus. There's three early church fathers that don't mention the fish and only bread, and then there's also John 21 where Jesus feeds his disciples fish. There's a lot of evidence that was added to the Bible later than when it was composed, and so looking at this sort of deconstruction of the Bible, there's some things that I found were interesting as well while I was writing, and I thought others would find as well. And then also probably the most interesting part, the most neglected verse in the Bible, Hosea 2:18. I was shocked when I found out that Jesus' new covenant includes animals, but that's been historically ignored.
Yes, and we see, the rainbow covenant is my most favorite part of the Bible in Genesis, and people overlook that too. Right from the very beginning of our concept of the Lord in Holy Scripture, we are taught that He was making covenants with the creatures.
Right, right. And also, what I always find interesting about Genesis 9, and you probably know this too, but people will often use that and say, oh, well, Genesis 9, that's the first time God allows us to eat meat. And then they overlook the fact that right before that, in Genesis 8:20 to 21, Noah sacrifices animals. That's where the meat comes from. And then God says humans have an evil heart from their childhood. So that's sort of linked with this Genesis 9 allowing meat, and it's a very overlooked passage.
It certainly is. And I'm curious, do you have a favorite Bible verse?
Favorite Bible verse? Well, verses, I would say definitely Isaiah 11:6-9. I think that's probably either that one or Revelation 21:4 is great too. He will wipe away every tear and death shall be no more. I tend to be, I like a lot of the eschatological sort of verses that predict a time where there will be peace and harmony for all.
Yes, yes. And as Frank says, on earth as it is in heaven.
Yes, Matthew 6:10. How about you, too? Do you have a favorite verse?
Oh my goodness, I really don't. I mean, I lean toward a lot of the ones that you've mentioned today. I think the most profound verse is the Rainbow Covenant, because when I was in my theology class, we talked about how they used repetition to enforce it. So if you read that part of Scripture, the covenant isn't just mentioned once; it's mentioned multiple times.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So true. Yeah, and it's like I think it's like 3 or 4 times that God says, "I'll remember my covenant between all living creatures and humans."
Yes, like I mean, they know, it. We're obviously hard-headed. That needed to be repeated,
Yep.
and now it needs to come to life and be realized and acted upon. So I know that you mentioned earlier that this book came from parts you didn't use in I Will Abolish the Bow, but for those that haven't read that book, would you like to explain it a little bit and how it differs?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and in I Will Abolish the Bow, I had not talked about how our treatment of animals ends up hurting humans. And so Pride Goes Before Destruction, the latest one, is more holistic. Whereas I Will Abolish the Bow, it's almost exclusively talks about the animals, which is you know uh, also good, I think. But in I Will Abolish the Bow, I took the Bible also at sort of face value. Um, and then in Pride Goes Before Destruction, I was interested in sort of deconstructing the Bible, um, taking it apart, seeing how it has changed over time with translations and possible additions. And it can help explain some of the more problematic passages in relation to being kind to animals.
Awesome. And I'm jumping back and forth between the different questions and comments.
Not a
And
problem.
but before we go too far, I think I'd like to interject another question. It seems appropriate as we just passed talking about this. So Brian is saying it's clear to him that Jesus was a vegan. However, the Bible doesn't and tries to cover it up. Do you think people are being deceived, and how can evil enter the Bible and try to trick people?
Yeah, that's a tough one because let me think. It's very clear to me that Jesus was vegan. However, why does the Bible try and cover this up? It's possible. I don't know that it's clear cut that Jesus was vegan based on the Bible. I mean, in the book too, I talk about that too. There's what the actual Greek says. It's interesting because if you go to it's Luke 42, or no, wait, what is it? Luke 24, 41 to 43. That's where Jesus eats fish, and it's actually inconclusive about whether he eats it or not because in the original Greek, as well as the KJV, it keeps alive that sort of ambiguity. Like it says in the KJV, the disciples gave him fish and honeycomb, but he chose it and ate it, but it doesn't say these. And so it's interesting because it's like he was presented with the choice of either one, but it wasn't. It's very unclear about which one he chose, and you could obviously interpret that as he chose the honeycomb instead of the fish. Um, Now, was Jesus vegan then? I don't know. There's a lot of evidence that he was vegetarian, which is, and I don't know if it was possible to be vegan back then. But the Bible covering it up, I think there's maybe a case that can be made for that. I talk about that in my book about how there's a lot of passages that might have been edited, like for instance Luke 21, 34 to 36. Traditionally, the passage states. Be wary of the anxiety of the world and don't be drinking wine so much. And then there's a Syriac version of the Bible which there's a lot of theories that the Syriac actually came before the Greek and that this is probably the earliest passage or it could be the earliest passage. And it talks about Jesus condemns eating meat and drinking wine. And it makes a lot of sense too, because he's basically reiterating Proverbs 23, 20 to 21. And so there is some maybe historical evidence that Jesus criticized eating meat. I don't know if it's that Jesus was vegan and the Bible is hiding that. I don't know if that could be a case for that could be made, but I could believe that he was a vegetarian and maybe the Bible sort of made him more of a meat eater through translations and additions and things like that. That's certainly possible. But as far as being vegan, I don't know if that was possible back then, just because you would need vitamin B12, zinc, those which are kind of hard to obtain without animal products. And today we have fortified foods and things like that. So I think, but conclusion, I think you could definitely make a case that Jesus was vegetarian back then.
Thank you. And I want to ask also, what led you to expand on Jesus in the second book? Because obviously, as we're having this dialogue, there's a lot more about him in the second book.
Yes, and well, regarding the issue of animal rights too, Jesus has always been a source of great inspiration as well as frustration, because he's got these really great teachings like treat others the way you want to be treated, love your neighbor as yourself, be the servant of all. And then Jesus also taught his believers to make the world like Eden and the paradise of the new earth, which, Eden and the new earth are both places that are vegan. And so all those teachings are really great for animals. However, most translations of the Bible depict Jesus eating fish. And so Jesus' inconsistency on this was very problematic for our ministry. So I decided to dig a little deeper and find out if there was information out there about Jesus being a vegetarian, or at least being sympathetic to the cause. And turns out there's a lot of extra biblical information about Jesus teaching vegetarianism, and then most of his disciples in the early church were vegetarian. And so it's odd that somehow most of his early followers and even his brother abstained from meat, but somehow he missed the message. And so there's also alternate translations of several Bible verses that put into question Jesus being a meat eater. Like, for instance, also too, in extra biblical, there's a quote from an Ebionite and Epiphanius. He was an early church father, and he wrote a book about different followings of Jesus that maybe were wrong. And he asked this one Ebionite, he said, why do you guys abstain from flesh, or why do you abstain from meat? And he says, because Christ revealed it to me. And so there's a lot of extra biblical information about Jesus abstaining from meat, and that would align also with the other things he taught, like about divorce. He said, God never wanted divorce. He only allowed it as a concession. What he wants you to do is having a long-lasting or never separating marriage. And it's the same thing, if you apply that to meat, God wanted us to eat only plants, and then only allowed meat as a concession. And so Jesus being a vegetarian would certainly be a possibility. And I raised that possibility in my latest book.
Thank you. I think also um, the culture today we live in does not recognize that meat 3 times a day, 5 times a day, whatever, what was not the norm until like the last couple of 100 years, and it has grown exponentially with the factory slavery. And we can see our health declining, as well as so many billions of creatures being just tormented, tortured, and then killed. But it was not common practice to have meat. It was a rarity, not an everyday expectation as we are living in today. It's
That's
just
so true.
I think that's just another trick of the industry, you know.
Right.
Let's normalize something that has never been normal throughout human history. And then, and then the Christians of today are fighting with one another about, focus on veganism, when really it was the way we have most always been on planet Earth.
Right. That's so true. And it's also, I raised that point in my book too about how I think regardless of what Jesus ate, I think he would definitely say that humans eat way, 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 way too much meat today. I mean, I don't think like I was reading, I put that in the book actually about how the average American, I think, eats 212 pounds of meat a year. And it's like the average, Israelite back then, maybe ate meat 3 times a month at most. And it was extremely expensive back then too. It wasn't subsidized by the government. There's a lot of different factors that it's not exactly the same thing as it is today, especially with the cruelty involved. And meat was a rare source and also extremely expensive. And so for them to have it back then, it would have been extremely unlikely.
Yes, and we have a really nice conversation going on in the chat, and I want to thank everyone participating in YouTube for being so respectful of one another. It's nice to see, but I want to, since we heard Brian earlier, I want to share a comment from Johnny Rose, and he said he thinks that Jesus would have eaten meat because it was a tradition not to offend the host. So there's more reasons than one thinks of initially about why some of these traditions and what the meanings of the scripture might actually be. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That might be something I can write about in the future too, because I know there's a verse in Luke too where Jesus says he's he's preaching to the disciples and he says when you're going out and preaching the gospel, eat whatever is before you. And it was sort of this sort of like temporary dispensation where it's like, hey, the gospel comes first. Don't make a big squabble about what's in front of you about food. Just get the gospel in there and then deal with it later. Um,
So, do you, Vita, I would absolutely love to bring you in at this point to ask your question about his other book, because I think that ties in so well with this current dialogue we're in. So I'm going to bring in our staff person, Vita, who's been behind the scenes. Vita?
Great, Matthew. Thank you so much. This is really great.
yeah,
I wanted to know, as a nurse, how is it, when is it appropriate, and how do you share veganism with your patients who are literally killing themselves?
that's a really good question, actually, and that's sort of the root of the second book I wrote, Meet the New Cigarette. And as a nurse, I sort of made that link too because I remember like when I worked at the hospital, there was this very strict policy about like if anybody's smoking cigarettes, they get tossed out. Like it's either the cigarettes or them, and they're very serious about it. And I found out there's this actual there's a policy made by the Joint Commission which regulates hospitals where you're not allowed to have cigarettes in hospitals. It's a big no-no because of obvious health risks as well as a fire hazard and things like that. And I thought to myself, what if we applied that to meat and animal products? Like with all the disease that's associated with it.
Yeah.
It was sort of a logical extension. And then I sort of I probed the Joint Commission a little bit about that too, about what would it take to ban meat in hospitals. And there's sort of already like there's a lot of talk, especially in there's a Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. There's all kinds of talk about banning processed meat and red meat from hospitals. And
Mm-hmm.
to be honest, too, I think hospitals are sort of aware of that. And so a lot of hospitals, they won't necessarily serve that on their menu, but they will allow it like on the premises. But I wish they were as strong about it as cigarettes.
Right.
But the question, yeah, but how about how to talk to it with patients though? I'm not involved with direct patient care as much anymore now because I do case management, and so I'm not as directly involved as much with patient
Mhm.
care. But I know my wife deals a lot with patients directly, and a lot of times, she'll mention that too. Like when they'll do like routine cholesterol checks, and they'll see that their cholesterol is high or something like that, and my wife will say, hey, a solution to this is, cut down on the amount of animal products. She noticed that if you say it too strongly, like cut it all out, they won't necessarily listen. But if
Mhm.
you push them towards the plant-based sort of perspective, that they are inclined to listen, which is good. It's a good way to get your foot in the door with the issue.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
There are fewer McDonald's restaurants in hospitals today than there used to be.
That's good to know.
So, hey, yay.
It's absurd that they were ever even there.
We'll call it progress.
Right. The bar's low.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vida.
Thanks, Vita.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions, but before we go to the rest of them, I want to ask the last thing on my list. So we've talked about your book, and I want to segue into how does one get your book? And also, we have an event coming up, and would you like to talk about that a little bit?
I think so. Yeah, I can do that. But as far as buying my book, it's through preferably through the publisher, Whip and Stock. There's a website link. I can include that. Let me just grab that real quick. I'll just put this in the chat here. Yeah, it's through them. And then there's also, it's available through Amazon and bookshop.org. And then there's bound to be more retailers in the future. I know with my last book, I saw it like it was at Target and like Barnes & Noble and things like that. And so they'll pick it up too, I imagine, in the future. And then in the Pittsburgh area, also, if you find yourself in Pittsburgh or live there, I'm going to be autographing copies of the book at the Pittsburgh Vegan Expo on July 8th and the Pittsburgh Veg Fest on August 5th. And so you can buy a copy at our table at Christian Animal Rights Association. And I'll be happy to autograph it. And you get a free bookmark as well. And then we also have the upcoming book group. Do you have the dates for that too? We're going to do a read along. Plan.
I do. So it will start on start on July 16th. And that's a Sunday, and it will be at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And what this group is, for those of you that haven't participated in our other Out Loud reading group, in today's society, it's really hard to pre-read a book to participate in a reading group. And yet, reading groups are such amazing ways to focus and hone in on words and subject matter that you might miss if you read it on your own. So this is the best of both worlds. You don't have to pre-read anything. All you have to do is get a copy of the book and show up at the group. Now it's a closed Zoom. To get to register for it, I'm going to ask everyone if they will just email me, and I'll put my email up right here. So if you want to send me an email and tell me you want to be in this closed group, we will add you. The groups will be 90 minutes long on the Sunday nights, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And Matthew has been kind enough to agree to participate with us. So, yeah, I'm so glad. The last book we did, Homo Ahimsa, Judy Carmen, who is the author of that book, participated with us too. And it makes it such a rich experience. So we're going to limit the class size to 20 because we want to keep it reasonable. So everyone would show up with their book, and they'll just read a section, as little or as much as they're comfortable with. And then at the end, we have Matthew at our disposal, so we can ask him questions or comments. Or sometimes in the first group, they were more organic, so there were conversations that went on during it. But it's a safe place for vegans or respectful pre-vegans to come and have a dialogue with us about Matthew's newest work.
Yeah, I'd love to answer any questions related to it too. I think it's going to be a great experience.
I do too. And at the end of this live stream, I'll put the information up too. So one of the other questions that has come in is about they've previewed your book, but they haven't had time to sit down and read it all. And they know you talk about the 12 commandments in the book and a new way to envision things. Would you speak on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, like the 10 Commandments part, I think is what they were referencing.
Yes. Yes.
Oh yeah, sure. So what I noticed too is I tried to like sort of look over through the Bible and figure out like what all is entailed with a new covenant. Like Jesus dying, what does that what does that mean exactly? And obviously it's dying for sins, and that everybody knows that part. Um, and then there was these other features of the new covenant, like Hosea 2:18. It says, "I will abolish the bow. I will make it so that all creatures will lie in safety." And I talk about the covenant includes animals, and so we're supposed to be starting to work towards that, or building a world like a. I use the analogy of like a seed growing into a tree, and the verse. Obviously, we're not going to be able to accomplish that verse entirely, but we'll build it towards the perfect completion of that in on the new earth, in heaven, basically. But there's also this other feature of the new covenant, and it's talked about in 2 Corinthians 3:5-6. Paul talks about the spirit of the verse, the spirit of the passage. That's a feature of the new covenant that started, and it's basically he says he basically applies a verse, even though it wasn't maybe applied originally to a group of people, he applies that to another group, and you can see this throughout the New Testament actually too, because he does this in 1 Corinthians 9. He talks about he took a passage that was written for cows, specifically oxen, and it says, "Don't muzzle the oxen while it's treading out the grain." And so that was originally written because it's cruel to muzzle the oxen while they're working, because they deserve a share of the crop because they're working for it. So he applied that to Christian pastors. He said, the concept of this cow eating and obtaining his payment for his services, that's what we need to do with pastors, is as they work, they get services for their payment. And so he took a verse that was for a cow and then applied it to humans. And I said, well, why don't we do it the reverse then? With the 10 Commandments, that was written exclusively. If you look at the text, actually, it's written exclusively to Israelite slave owning men, because it says, do not covet one's slave, do not covet one's wife. And so I said, what if we applied that to animals? Like with the new covenant starting, we can say, thou shalt not steal, right? Well, what do we do to animals all the time? We steal their lives, we steal their secretions, we steal their children from them. And then also, do not murder. What do we do to animals every day, 3 times a day? And so that's the feature of the new covenant, is applying it beyond to whom it was specified.
And most likely how it was meant to be applied all along.
Right. Yeah, that's the other part. Right. Is Hosea 2:18 has been ignored.
Have you had an opportunity to ever speak about the scripture through vegan eyes versus your prior experience before you were vegan? I mean, I find it in my own life remarkable. I read the same passages I read pre-vegan, and they have an entirely different meaning.
Right. It's so true too. And it's like, well, even too, like the one everybody always talks about too, and probably the most frequent I get in my experience is people will say, "Oh, we have dominion over animals," and being raised, I always thought that just meant we have unlimited power over them. And then right in that same paragraph, it says to eat only plants, and that it's just amazing how that's been totally ignored and totally looked over.
Yes. I think we have unfortunately changed that word to mean domination.
Yes, that's an exact wording of it. Exactly. It's and it's amazing too. And scholars too. I'm even more amazed. Like there's this one website that they have these incredibly educated clergy. Like one guy, he has a doctorate, and he's citing all out of context with dominion, and it's quite amazing. Yeah, despite his education, how he's overlooked that.
Yes. Okay. We just have so many comments and different things. I'm so delighted to see this kind of activity.
Absolutely.
Here's another comment from Brian. After I went vegan, the Bible became a new book. Isn't that true? And I think that can be said too of what we hope the churches become someday. Certainly is in my world. And the next question, before we run out of time,
Sure.
The next question I want to ask is someone who works with youth in the church just is asking for suggestions about ways that you may talk to youth that would be age appropriate and who might not read your book. Are there things you would suggest? And also she of course is concerned, like so many Christian vegans are, about really losing her standing for speaking up. So any words of advice or encouragement you could give?
I know dealing with youth too. I think one really powerful aspect is when I used to work with Christian Vegetarian Association. That was sort of like the beginning of my vegan journey. They had these really awesome coloring books that had like Adam and Eve, like with the animals in it, and then like Noah saving the animals on the boat. And I was always thinking too, what would be really great is if they made like a coloring book of like Isaiah 11. That would be a really great way to talk to kids about that too. And like, you could even just put like messages on it. Like in the future we all won't hurt animals, or something like that would be a really great approach. And then also too, just highlighting verses in the Bible too, like Isaiah 11, Hosea 2:18, Isaiah 65, all those passages that speak positively about animals too. I don't think that would be anything offensive. I mean, it's in the Bible, and so I don't see why parents would be upset about that. um, I think probably just bringing things to people's attention, and especially with kids too, because kids just naturally love animals. And they're conditioned not to, and conditioned to sort of turn them into products. And that would probably be most of my advice, I think. I don't know if a coloring book exists, but something like that probably would be. I know with Christian Vegetarian Association, it was a really great opportunity to connect with kids about the subject. It was sort of non-confrontational. Kids would love to color it.
So Vita has just shared a link.
Awesome.
The Christian CVA does have a coloring book. So let me just copy this into the chat where everybody can see it. Thank you, Vita.
Thanks, Vita.
And the next question we have, let me just grab my phone.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Okay, there's that link. All right, so while you're looking at the link, the next question I have is, what advice would you give someone who's living in a Christian household and they're vegan and they want to encourage their elderly parents? And this can be a really tough subject too. Is there things that come to mind out of one of your books, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good subject. I wonder. They're probably not too keen on watching documentaries, I'd imagine. But I know film can be a really powerful method, and even like I don't want to say be deceiving, but it's almost like there's a lot of sort of vegan movies out there that aren't explicitly vegan. Like that would be a good maybe subject to approach, like to sort of get them thinking about it. Like I know Ferdinand. It's a movie about a bull. It's an animated movie actually. I don't know if they'd be interested in it or not, but Ferdinand is like a bull that he just wants to sniff flowers all day, but he's being used for bullfighting, and they have some really strong criticism in there about meat eating and killing bulls for meat and things like that. So like movies with sort of like a disguised vegan message would be something that's good. Another possibility too. Trying to think what would get their mind moving. There's always like Veg News, the magazine, and I think sort of it depends on how old your parents are too. Because I know like with my family, I think everybody was sort of hesitant about it, but I think when boomers, at least my parents are boomers, when you start talking about health, I think everybody's ears perk up a little bit too. Like as people age, obviously the ingestion of animal products isn't helping them as far as their health goes, and no one wants to be sick, so that's a good topic to bring up too. Is maybe, oh hey mom, can we cut down on meat a little bit because I'm concerned about your heart disease risks, or things like that might be a good idea.
Excellent suggestions. Thank you. Someone asked how to reach you, so I am going to put up your email that you shared with everyone. So it's info@christiananimalrights.com.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and then like I said too, you can also go to the website. And it's christiananimalrights.com. There's an inquiry form too if you have a question, and our team will be happy to answer it as well too. If it's something that's like theological or anything like that. Not either way is fine though. That's totally fine. Just another option.
And someone just asked, are you looking for volunteers?
You know what? Not yet, but certainly in the future. I know this coming year too, we're mostly focusing on education here in the fall, and then also sort of promoting the book and getting some videos out on education, and then also legislation. But I know in the future, like I always say, our goal is to reach every church in the world. So we want to really ramp up the animal rights activism, and definitely like as far as like tabling at events and things like that. That's definitely something that we could definitely look forward to. It's sort of a very slow process because it's like our team is sort of small right now, but we're growing.
Thank you. And I'm curious because I have never asked you this, and I'm not asking for an exact city, but are you in the Northeast or Southeast, or where are you located?
We're based out of Pittsburgh, PA, but we call ourselves an international ministry, so we mostly just function online. But we don't have like a physical location or anything yet. But we would love to get there someday.
Awesome. And how are you funded? Are you looking for donors or what?
Yeah, we mostly just get funded through donors and merchandise. We sell actually. We'll be selling our T-shirt actually at the Vegan Expo. This is our latest one. I'll kind of show it to you. It's Hosea 2:18. It's got a depiction on there. And so merchandise we sell through our website off of Bonfire. We have 2 T-shirts as well as a tote bag. So we get a lot of stuff through there. And then all the proceeds from the book also benefit the organization. And then there's also donations. Donations are always great. Yeah, that helps us very much. And we appreciate any sort of help, of course. And all the donations, all the money goes to the organization. No one has a paid salary or anything like that. It's all volunteer. It's pretty much me and my wife that run it, and then we have 3 board members that sort of oversee everything. And so we're small but growing.
Awesome, and that's a beautiful shirt.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we Bonfire actually did the design, and we showed the verse to them, and then they sort of made a really great picture out of it. And so
Nice.
we weren't sure if the book was going to be ready for the upcoming Vegan Expo, and so we got the shirts ready just in case. But now the shirts and the book are both ready, so we have lots of stuff to distribute at the expos.
Very good. I can't wait to see you again in person. And our last question today is someone wants to know, do you have another book in the background? Are you working on a manuscript or?
You know what? There's some material that I didn't get to. Like for instance, there's a lot of passages in Ezekiel and Revelation about animals being in heaven right now, and it's really interesting because I could probably write 5 chapters on it because it's so involved. Because a lot of it is like, for whatever reason, probably hubris. In Revelation, the term for animals in this heavenly place next to the throne of God, it's been translated as angels, but there's a different word that's used as angels in that same chapter of Revelation. And so the word actually is zoon, Z-O-O-N. And so, which translates in Greek is the zoo is the term for animal. It translates to English. And so I'm going to really piece that apart in the next book, is talking about how that's been sort of ignored, and how, there's definitely animals in heaven, and how that's been disguised through translations. And then I also want to talk about in the future, there's some other things too. Like I have actually, let me pull it up actually too, because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But there's questions about like what did God order in Eden? Like, was it a fruitarian diet? Because everybody knows it was vegan, but to what degree was it? And then I also wanted to tackle too, if Jesus ever ate Passover as a child. There's evidence that he didn't as an adult. And so I want to tackle that and see if there's anything on that. And then there's also too the question of whether Jesus was omniscient. I'm going to look at that, like, because there's moments in the Bible where it seems like he's all knowing and people know that he's all knowing because he's God. But then there's also these moments like this woman was bleeding and she touched his robe, and he said, "Who touched my robe?" And so obviously he wasn't omniscient at that moment. And so when did he choose to be omniscient and when did he not? And I was going to focus on that because that can help maybe explain why he let the demons go into the pigs. Is like maybe he didn't know that the demons were going to drive the pigs into the lake, or something to that degree. I like to always say too that maybe if he did eat that fish, maybe he didn't realize that his believers would be using it to justify, enslaving animals for centuries. And sort of looking at the omniscience of Jesus. And then another big part of the next book too is going to be a focus on Genesis 18, because there's a passage in there where an angel eats meat, or Abraham, he serves meat to a bunch of angels, and a lot of people think that that's Jesus, even though there's a lot of historical evidence that that's not Jesus. And so I'm gonna look into that as well. And then the final portion of the next book too is it's going to be a big discussion on Romans 14, because that's probably the most frequently cited passage as far as against veganism, because it says the meat eater should abstain should tolerate the one who abstains, and the one who abstains from meat should tolerate the one who eats. And I've discovered, I talked about that in my previous book, how it's not really, that's talking about meat sacrificed to idols. It's not really talking about vegetarianism at all. But there's a way that we can maybe apply that principle, because later in the chapter it says, if meat is offensive to someone, then stop eating it. And so I was thinking, if we applied that to a church, if we said, hey, there's a vegan in your church, and so shouldn't you guys stop serving meat, or something to that degree, where we can apply that principle and sort of take it in the other direction from where it's historically been used. And so that'll be probably the gist of my upcoming book, but it's going to be probably many, many years from now, because I don't nearly have enough material for a full manuscript. But I'm always, anytime I encounter an argument on Facebook or Instagram where someone is arguing, I always try to think, I haven't heard that yet, so I'll put that in my next book.
I can't wait to read your next book. and the comments continue to just stream in. I cannot thank you enough for your time today, Matthew. And I so look forward to starting this group with you in 2 Sundays from today, right now, actually.
Yep.
We'll be getting ready to prepare. Now, they will be at 8 p.m. on Sundays, starting July 16th. And everyone, thank you so much for your attention and time tonight. Matthew, thank you. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we close?
Oh, no, just thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and all your promotion and helpfulness with the book. I really appreciate it. And then thank you for everybody for attending and your awesome questions. I really appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, thank you all. And everyone, have a wonderful night. And we will be back again soon with another interview. Peace be with you all.